Hi, welcome to Real Talk. I'm your host, Dr. Asha. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you joined us for the first episode of this season, season 5, last week, you heard my conversation with Lauren Johnston about grief and loss. That conversation has stayed with me this last week, and not only because we talked about loss, which I know that all of us can relate to, but we talked about this invisible kind of rule that seems to arrive with it. You know, how you're supposed to grieve, how long it's supposed to take you to get back to quote unquote normal, how much of your pain you're supposed to let other people see, what is allowed, how much of what we call coping well is simply doing what we're taught other people would find acceptable. That's the question that I was left with underneath all these expectations. I just kept on pondering that. How much of what we call coping well or dealing with things is what we're taught because other people find it acceptable. So we're actually finding ourselves making ourselves smaller or growing ourselves bigger, whatever it may be. And I mean that on an energetic level of how we operate. The question is not just about, and it doesn't pertain only to grief. It has followed me in relationships, into family, into work, into every aspect. And eventually, it followed me into a moment when someone asked me for something and I said yes while my entire body was saying no. How many of you have had that experience? So I want to actually revisit our topic about boundaries. We spoke about this a couple of seasons ago, and I want to talk about that again today because it's going to be one of these conversations, that I think comes up in different ways. It's something that we need to get underneath the words that we're using. What happens to our nervous system, our family history, our culture, our faith, everything, our identity, when you have this intense fear of disappointing people? You enter this conversation in a different way. It's a big mashup of everything, really. I mean, you may have been raised in one place, shaped by another, and now completely rooted somewhere else. And one part of you may have been taught that independence is healthy, for example. And another part of you may have been taught that family comes before the individual. And one voice in your head says protect your time. The other one says respect your elders, speak your truth. It gets confusing sometimes until you say no to something. You may not even realize that you are conflicted with these dilemmas constantly. Someone I cared about asked me to take something on for them. I'm going to keep the details private because this episode is not really about the person or the particular request. I don't want anything, too dramatic here. It's just about getting to the root of everything. It was nothing, harmful. There was no threatening involved. There was no shouting, nothing like that. It was the kind of request that looked very innocent on the surface. Okay. It was the kind that looked completely reasonable when you wrote it down, when you read it in black and white. But that is partly why these moments can be so confusing. We expect a boundary problem to arrive wearing this huge warning sign. We imagine someone being so demanding that, behaving badly, disrespecting. But sometimes the person asking has done nothing wrong. Sometimes the request is ordinary. The conflict is happening entirely inside of you. The message came through while I was already tired, okay? This message from this person, this request, not the kind of tired that one good night's of sleep is going to fix. I was exhausted. Was going through a lot of things, the kind where your brain has been making decisions all day, your body's running on habit and on adrenaline, and you have a lot of responsibility that you're thinking one more thing is going to set me over. And you become deeply irritated just by the sound of any ping on your phone. And I read this message, and my first response was an immediate no way. Not an angry no, not a punishing no, just no. I don't have the energy for this. I don't have the time for this. I don't want to do this. The answer appeared perhaps like a half a second later than the negotiations began. My mind started saying, well, it's not that much. They're not asking you to do that much. I don't want them to think I'm selfish. I don't want them to think that I'm not, going to be helpful? What if they stop asking me for things? What if they're hurt? I started going like on this complete tizzy in my head of thinking about all these different things. What kind of person says no to something so small? Started judging myself. And I noticed how quickly the question changed. The original question was, can you do this? But inside my head was, what will this say about who you are if you refuse? Just very quickly like that. And that is a very different question. Now, I was no longer deciding really whether I had the capacity to help. I was defending my identity though. Was I being kind? Was I being loyal? Was I being genuine? Was I being generous? Will I still be a good friend or a good person? And when the request became this referendum to my goodness, saying no can feel very dangerous and can feel very scary. The voice I heard did not sound cruel at all, but it caught my attention because it sounded loving, familiar, and it sounded like it was protecting me. Good people do not make things difficult, for example. Good people help at all times. That may be true. But I realized that these were ideas that I had either been taught or just started believing. And I do believe that community matters. I do believe that relationships, relationships are based on give and take. We're not meant to live isolated as individuals who never inconvenience ourselves for another human being. But sacrifice chosen freely is different from sacrifice made under the threat of shame. And I spent decades studying this, understanding stress, understanding how the nervous system responds to perceived danger. There's a certain language. And still in that moment that this was happening, I could not immediately tell whether I was protecting a relationship or abandoning myself. It was really, truly a humbling experience. And knowledge does not make you immune to your conditioning. You can have all the knowledge in the world, but the way that you have been raised, the beliefs that you have, the triggers that you have, they're there. They're innately there. And insight doesn't always erase the pattern. Sometimes it only allows you to notice the pattern when you're still practicing and participating in that pattern. And that is what happened. I noticed my breath getting shallow. I noticed my shoulders get tense. I noticed the urgency. I felt as though I had to answer immediately, even though nobody had asked for an immediate answer. But I was putting this pressure on myself. How many of you out there have had that? The urgency was information. Healthy decisions usually leave room for thought. You should have time to think about things. Conditioned decisions often feel like they must be made because you have time to hear yourself right at that moment. And I wish I could tell you that I paused at that time because that's the advice that I would give. But I didn't put my phone down. I didn't pause. I said yes anyway, even though everything about it was saying no. And I think the important thing to tell you there is that because we're often turning our healing into another performance, we tell the story only after we've responded perfectly because of what it feels like, what it looks like. We present the awareness as if it immediately produced a flawless decision-making process. And sometimes the win is smaller than that. Sometimes the win is to hear the old voice while it's speaking. Sometimes the win is to realize that the guilt has arrived before you have done anything wrong. And sometimes the win is noticing that your mouth said yes while your body remained unconvinced. And that's what I did. And we do this from time to time in our lives. Maybe we do it continuously. But for the first time in a very long time, I knew who had answered, and it wasn't me. I want to talk about what may be happening in the body during a moment like that, because we have these moments. Most of us have heard of fight or flight. When the brain senses danger, the body prepares itself to confront the threat or escape from it. You may also be familiar with freezing. That's the moment when you feel stuck. You feel numb, you feel blank, you're unable to respond. And there's, another response that happens that describes what happens when your system attempts to create safety by pleasing and accommodating and calming other people. That's the fawning phase. And it's not a formal diagnosis at all, nothing like that, but it's the part where the fight says, I will overpower the danger. The flight says, I will get away from the danger. The freeze says, I cannot move. And the fawn says, I will keep you happy so that you do not become dangerous. Now, dangerous, what do I mean by that? Doesn't always mean physically harming, okay? The danger might be rejection, conflict, disapproval, silence, withdrawal, being ungrateful or being called ungrateful, being accused of changing, of not being who you used to be. The possibility that someone will think less of you because you're not acting the same way that the old you used to act. It doesn't matter, it's like those, whatever it may be, is that doesn't mean that you're dishonest or weak. It does not mean that you lack confidence or that you lack compassion. It is your body's way. It's been conditioned to respond in this way. Okay. And we have to change the script. We have to change the story of that we're telling ourselves, that we're always the responsible one, the person that everyone can rely upon, and that, these qualities may have genuinely served you. Okay. I'm not saying that they're bad qualities at all. They may have helped you even succeed or have helped your family. They've helped you keep important relationships. But the goal is to notice whether you are operating from an old survival strategy and still making decisions that belong to your adult self, or is it culture and society that's telling you that you need to act that way? Or what exactly is it? What is your true response? What are you really wanting to do? How can you listen to yourself? It makes it really a difficult thing because you're afraid of conflict to have with someone else, but you're actually in conflict with yourself. And you are afraid that choosing yourself means betraying everything that has shaped you. Then perhaps, you move into a more individualistic culture. Now you're told to prioritize yourself, protect your peace, cut people off. That language can feel liberating, but it can also feel foreign to you, harsh, incomplete. So you've got all these different voices that are coming at you. Whose voice is yours? And that's the reason why this question feels really ancient. Whenever you ask yourself, whose voice is it? Human beings have always struggled to find their own voice beneath duty, loyalty, fear, expectations. In the ancient Indian text, Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna stands on a battlefield overwhelmed by conflict. He's not weak. He's not careless. He is deeply aware of the consequences of his actions. He's looking at people he loves, respects, feels so connected. Duty is speaking, fear is speaking, family is speaking, love is speaking, all at the same time. And with all the voices shouting at once, he cannot move. He freezes. This is not only an ancient problem, that is a regular Tuesday or Wednesday in your life. That is a message you have not answered in the last 3 hours. That is staring at your phone, not typing the words no instead of no problem and deleting it 6 times. That's wondering whether one honest answer will undo years of connection. If one honest answer will undo your friendship, undo the years, it may not have been a true connection to begin with. Now, why am I talking about this? The value of the story is not to give some sort of simple formula for you. It shows us that our inner conflict is not proof that we are failing. Okay? Sometimes the inner conflict, whether it is what we're talking about last week about grief, that you may be conflicted about the way you feel, it's okay. We have to understand that our choice matters. Our voice matters. The task is not to silence every inherited voice that you get. The voices contain a history. They contain a story. They contain people who loved us. They contain lessons. But you have an inherited wisdom, an inherited fear that can sound remarkably similar. So we have to learn to listen carefully. It's one of those things, whenever you get your strength that comes from clarity and knowing what voice you're serving, knowing the reason and the intention behind your actions, the reason behind your no. there's some power, there's an empowerment that happens for you. It's about the clarity. It's about knowing that you're serving and not losing yourself at the same time. Understanding that the devotion without discernment can become self-erasure where you just don't exist. Ask yourself, before you agree to something, is this my voice or is this inherited? Not because inherited voices are wrong, not at all. But how are you going to learn to listen to yourself? Are you making your decisions consciously? Or are you letting your father's expectations, your mother's fear, whatever it is, define what your answer is? Sometimes after asking that question, I may still choose to say yes, because I may decide that the relationship matters enough for me to stretch a little bit. I may choose duty. You may choose duty. You may choose loyalty. You may choose sacrifice. But the choice has to belong to yourself. A conscious choice, a conscious yes, feels way different than a frightened yes or a spiteful yes. A conscious yes may feel inconvenient, but it does not leave the same residue within. A frightened yes turns into resentment. We all know this. I'm sure those of you out there have known that whenever you have said yes to something that you really didn't want to, somewhere along the line, it has the possibility to turn into resentment. You agree, and then you feel angry because the person accepts the help that you offered. You say it's fine, but then you become hurt when nobody realized that it was not fine. That's not because you're unreasonable. It's because it's part of you that expected the other person to hear your no that you never said. We can't read minds. People cannot consistently honor boundaries that remain trapped inside our own bodies and minds. We have to speak up, and learning how to speak up, I know, can be scary, but it's part of our self-growth and empowerment. We have to recognize the voice that we have continued to swallow when we're talking about setting our boundaries. I want to leave you today with 3 questions. Not 3 questions that are going to fix every boundary problem, but 3 questions. It's a practice for you, okay? Before you answer a request, ask yourself, whose voice is this? Whose voice is telling me that saying no would make me selfish? Whose voice says that I must answer immediately? Whose voice says a good person would agree? You don't have to attack the voice. It's just observe it. Simply name it. That sounds something I learned as a child, or that sounds like something like where I'm disappointing my family, or that sounds like an old relationship. Just name the voice. Create a small amount of distance from it. And sometimes that distance is where choice begins. The second question is, what is my body doing right now? Before you analyze this request, notice what the body is receiving about it. Is your chest tight? Are your shoulders tight? Do you have a pit in your stomach? Are your jaws clenched? Are you leaning away from the person that's asking you the request? Do you feel this urgency to leave? The body is speaking to you. Your body recognizes a pattern before your thoughts will sometimes. And those of you that are skilled at explaining away the discomfort or the physical sensation, you say in your mind, oh, it's not a big deal. Your body might be saying, we've been here before. Okay, so listen to your body because it's always going to be speaking to you and telling you something. The third question is, what would I say if no one were watching to judge the answer? I love this one. Not your family, not your friends, not your peers, not your colleagues, not your audience, not the imaginary committee that you have inside your head. What would you say if your answer did not have to prove that you were loving, generous, respectful, a good person, spiritual, strong? Maybe the answer is no. Maybe the answer is yes. Maybe I need time to think is an answer. I can help, but only till this far. Whatever it may be, sometimes a boundary is not a refusal either. It's a delay. It's a compromise. Let me come back to you. There's nothing wrong with saying that. It creates time for your body to settle. It gives you the inherited, voices a chance to finish their spiel. And then sit down and find out what your voice is saying. You don't need to become fearless before setting a boundary. You don't need to feel certain, completely certain anyway, before you make a decision. You don't need everyone to agree with the boundary, that it's reasonable or unreasonable. Sometimes the body will shake and tell you, sometimes the guilt will arrive. Sometimes that old voice will tell you that you have hurt someone simply because they are disappointed. These are all stories that we tell. Disappointment is not always damage. Someone can dislike your boundary without your boundary being wrong. This practice is not about perfection. I want you to just try to notice things. Whose voice is this? What is my body doing? What would I say if no one were watching to judge me? So let me return to that moment where we started. I received a request, my body reacted, an old voice entered the room, and I said yes. And I still do not know whether I will answer differently next time. I would like to think that I would, knowing what I know now, but I also know that that change rarely happens because we shame ourselves into it, performing better. Change happens through our attention, our intention, through practice, through hearing the voice sooner. Maybe next time I'll notice before I answer. Maybe I'll take one good full breath before I answer. And maybe I'll just write, let me come back to you. How does this work in your life? I want to know from you. I'd love to hear from you. Which voice do you recognize while listening today? Was it the voice telling you to keep the peace? Was it the one to be grateful, to avoid disappointing people, to prove that you always need to be good or that you always need to be available? Drop us a comment below. I'd love to hear from you. If you haven't already, subscribe to Real Talk. I would greatly appreciate it and love to connect with you next time. Let's just take these moments together to slow down, to be able to take in the moments, to learn and deepen our way of how we're living life, to live a healthier, better future. Thank you so much. Until next time.